It started as a simple mission. A small unit sent to scout enemy movement, nothing more, nothing less. But sometimes, the simplest missions become the ones no one ever forgets. 10 soldiers set out that morning. By the time rescue teams arrived 10 days later, only 4 were still alive. And what they went through in those 10 days was something the army never talked about again. Their names were erased from reports. Their mission was labeled unrecorded. But their story, their pain, their will to survive, still whispers through the cracks of history. They called themselves Patrol Echo 7. Led by Sergeant James Riker, a man known for keeping calm when others broke. Beside him, Corporal Lewis, the quiet thinker, Private Harris, the youngest, and Martinez, the medic who carried more guilt than bullets. It was supposed to be a 2-day reconnaissance deep into the mountains. Light travel, no heavy combat, minimal risk. The weather was clear. The radio check was solid. The men joked as they moved out. But the mountains have their own way of keeping secrets. By the end of the first night, radio contact was gone. By morning, the maps meant nothing, landmarks disappeared under a thick fog, compasses spun uselessly, and the forest swallowed every sound. Riker's voice stayed calm. "We'll move downhill. Follow the stream. We'll find our way." But every direction looked the same. Every path led deeper into nowhere. And as the sun burned through the fog, they realized something chilling: their rations were running low. Only enough food for 3 days. No chance of resupply. No radio. 10 men. 10 days. Hunger doesn't start as pain. It starts as distraction, a constant thought that grows heavier each hour. The men joked at first, sharing one-liners about army food, pretending it didn't bother them. But by the second night, the jokes stopped. You could hear stomachs growling louder than footsteps. And in the silence of the forest, that sound felt cruel. Have you ever been so hungry that you couldn't think straight? That every sound, every heartbeat, felt like a reminder of what you don't have. Because for them, that feeling became their reality. Every breath was a test. Every sunrise a punishment. On the 3rd day, the first soldier collapsed. Private Jenkins. He'd been quiet all morning, walking slower, staring blankly at the ground. When Riker turned to check on him, he was already down, pale, trembling, lips cracked and dry. Martinez knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. "Dehydrated. Low blood sugar. He's not gonna make it far." Riker gave his last energy bar to Jenkins. But that night, Jenkins never woke up. No one spoke a word at dawn. They buried him beneath a thin layer of leaves. No ceremony, no prayers, just silence. And from that moment on, something changed in the air. The forest no longer felt alive. It felt like it was watching them. They rationed what was left. Half a cracker here. A sip of water there. Lewis tried to keep morale up by telling stories from home. About his daughter learning to ride a bike. About his wife who made bad coffee but good memories. For a few minutes, everyone smiled. But the smiles didn't last long. The hunger was too heavy. The silence too loud. That night, Riker couldn't sleep. He kept replaying every decision in his head. Should they have turned back earlier? Should he have ignored command orders and found another route? And then came the worst question of all: how many would still be alive tomorrow? The next morning, fog rolled in again. The forest felt endless. They had been walking in circles, the same river bend, the same dead tree, again and again. Lewis slammed his rifle butt into the ground and shouted, "We're lost! We're damn lost!" No one argued. Because deep down, they all knew he was right. Riker gathered them, voice steady but eyes hollow. "We stay together. We keep moving. We survive, no matter what it takes." His words hung in the air like a command and a prayer at once. The hunger grew stronger. The forest grew colder. And the men began to wonder not if they'd make it home, but how many would. They thought hunger would be their worst enemy. But soon they would learn that the real battle wasn't against the forest, it was against themselves. By the 4th day, hunger was no longer a feeling. It had become a presence, something that followed them like a shadow they couldn't shake. Every breath felt heavier, every step slower. The forest stretched endlessly around them, tall, dark, and indifferent. It didn't care that 10 men were starving beneath its branches. It didn't care that their stomachs were empty or that their eyes were starting to lose their light. Nature has no pity for soldiers. Their supply bags were almost empty. One cracked ration left between all of them. 10 men, staring at a single piece of dry food as if it were gold. No one spoke for a while. Then Riker broke the silence. "We share it. Equal pieces." He tore the ration slowly, careful not to crumble it. Each man took a tiny bit, smaller than a coin. They chewed in silence, not for taste, but for the memory of what food used to feel like. Lewis tried to laugh. "I'd trade my rifle for a cheeseburger right now." No one laughed back. Even humor felt too heavy to lift. Harris, the youngest, whispered, "Sergeant, are we gonna make it home?" Riker didn't answer right away. He just looked at the horizon, endless green swallowing endless gray. Then he said softly, "We'll make it home. We have to." But even his voice didn't sound sure anymore. Have you ever lied to someone, not to deceive them, but to give them hope? That's what Riker did that day. Because sometimes, hope is the only ration you have left. On the 5th day, the forest changed. The air grew thick and damp. The sound of insects buzzed constantly, reminding them that everything around was alive, except them. Their legs trembled from exhaustion. Martinez, the medic, began hallucinating. He swore he saw smoke rising in the distance, maybe from a village. The men followed him for hours, chasing a mirage that faded into nothing. By sunset, they realized they had walked in another circle. Lewis cursed under his breath. Riker clenched his fists. Martinez just stared blankly, mumbling apologies to no one. That night, they gathered around an unlit fire pit. No one dared use their last match. They just sat there, listening to the wind move through the trees like whispers. Harris pulled something from his pocket, a small photograph of his family. A woman and a baby smiling. He looked at it for a long time, then tucked it back carefully. "Just 10 days," he said quietly. "We can last 10 days. No one corrected him. Because they all knew they were already halfway there, and each day felt like a lifetime. The next morning, the forest tested them again. Rain started to fall, heavy, relentless, soaking through every layer of clothing. Their boots filled with mud, their hands blistered from climbing and crawling. They tried to collect water in their helmets, desperate for a drink that didn't taste like rust. Riker's voice cracked for the first time. "Keep moving! We stay together!" But even his words sounded small against the roar of the storm. When the rain stopped, the silence felt even louder. The men's faces were hollow, their eyes sunken. Lewis stumbled, falling to his knees. "I can't feel my legs," he whispered. Riker lifted him up, arm over his shoulder. "You don't have to feel them. Just move them." That line, strong, simple, human, kept them alive for another few hours. Hunger changes people. It turns patience into rage, and friendship into tension. On the 7th day, they started arguing, small things, stupid things. Whose turn it was to lead? Who had eaten more yesterday? Who was slowing the group down? Riker stopped them all. "Listen to me," he said, voice trembling. "The forest doesn't want us fighting. It wants us quiet, hopeless, dead. We're not giving it that satisfaction." For a moment, they were silent again. But deep down, everyone knew, hunger wasn't done testing them yet. That night, the men lay on the cold ground, staring at the stars they could barely see. Martinez whispered, "Maybe the stars are watching us. Maybe someone up there still cares." Lewis replied, half asleep, "Then tell them to drop a sandwich." The others smiled weakly. It was the only laugh they had left. When morning came, the forest looked the same, endless, quiet, cruel. But something inside them had changed. The men no longer dreamed of home. They dreamed of survival. Food had become a fantasy. Now, it was about breath. One breath. Then another. One step. Then another. By the 8th day, the forest had taken almost everything. Their strength. Their direction. Their sense of time. But what it couldn't take, not yet, was their will to keep moving. Still, that will was breaking, slowly, quietly. They no longer walked like soldiers. They stumbled like ghosts, dragging their feet through mud and roots. Their faces had grown pale, lips cracked, eyes hollow. Their uniforms hung loose on shrinking bodies. Each man carried his own kind of silence, the kind that comes from a body running on nothing but stubbornness. Martinez tried to count their steps. He stopped after 50 because he forgot what came next. Harris started talking to himself, softly, like whispering to a friend who wasn't there. "Just hold on," he said under his breath. "Just one more day." The others pretended not to notice. Because when men start talking to ghosts, you let them. The first wave of hunger had been pain. The second was numbness. Now came the third, the kind that makes you forget who you are. Lewis collapsed again. This time, he didn't get back up right away. Riker knelt beside him. "On your feet, Corporal." Lewis shook his head weakly. "There's nothing left to get up for." Riker grabbed his collar, voice cracking. "There's us. You get up for us." Lewis stared at him, eyes distant, and whispered, "Are we even still us?" The question hit harder than hunger. Have you ever looked at yourself and not recognized the person staring back? That's what starvation does. It doesn't just eat your body. It eats your mind. By evening, they found a small clearing with wild berries growing along a hill. Their hearts leaped. Food. Finally, something. They rushed toward it, hands trembling. But Martinez stopped them. "Wait," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They might be poisonous." The men froze, staring at the small red berries that looked like salvation, but might be death. Riker took one, rolled it between his fingers, then dropped it. "We can't risk it." Lewis laughed bitterly. "We can't risk it? We're dying already, Sergeant!" Silence. No one had an answer. They walked away, starving, angry, and empty-handed. That night, no one slept. The forest creaked and whispered. Every sound made them flinch. Harris broke the silence. "What do you think happens when we die?" Martinez sighed. "Maybe nothing. Maybe peace." Riker stared into the dark. "Maybe we just become part of the forest." The idea felt almost comforting. By morning, the men were different. Not physically, though they looked like shadows, but inside. Something in them had shifted. Hunger wasn't just an enemy anymore. It was part of them. It guided their thoughts, their choices, their fears. Martinez said quietly, "I think I'd eat anything right now." "Anything." No one replied. But everyone thought the same thing. Their movements slowed to half pace. They stopped talking. Even breathing hurt. Riker tried to keep discipline, head counts, orders, small routines, anything to remind them they were soldiers. But routines don't fill stomachs. And hunger doesn't respect rank. On the 9th day, they reached the river again, the same one they'd passed days ago. It meant they'd been walking in circles. Lewis threw his rifle into the water and screamed, "We're trapped! This forest is playing with us!" No one stopped him. No one cared about the rifle anymore. Riker sat down on a rock, staring at his trembling hands. He thought about home, the small house, the laughter, the sound of his son's voice. He whispered to himself, "You can't die here! Not like this!" Have you ever tried to remember what happiness feels like, but it's just gone? That's what the men felt that day. The world had become smaller, just trees, cold, and hunger. That night, Riker gathered what little strength he had left. He spoke softly but firmly. "We're not dying here. Do you hear me? 10 days or 100, we keep moving. Someone out there knows we're missing. They'll find us." The men listened. Not because they believed him, but because believing was easier than giving up. In the darkness, Harris clutched his photograph again. His lips moved silently, whispering a name only he could hear. Somewhere between the pain and the silence, he began to pray, not for rescue, but for forgiveness. They thought hunger was their worst enemy. But in the next days, the forest would test something far deeper, their humanity. And not everyone would pass that test. The tenth sunrise came cold and gray. The air smelled of rain and rot. Their boots sank into the same mud they'd crossed before, but this time, it felt heavier, like the earth itself wanted to keep them. 10 days without food. 10 days since they last felt full, or warm, or human. The forest had stopped being a place. It had become a mind cruel, endless, whispering lies. Riker's squad no longer spoke. Every sound felt like a weight. Even breathing seemed like a waste of energy. Martinez's lips were cracked and bleeding. Harris's hands shook constantly. Lewis walked barefoot. His boots had fallen apart days ago. Each step was pain, but stopping meant dying. When the rain started, no one ran for cover. They just stood there, heads tilted up, mouths open, drinking from the sky. The water tasted like life. For a moment, they felt human again. But hunger doesn't forgive moments. It comes back, sharper, hungrier, crueler. By midday, Martinez started to talk to himself again. He whispered names, some real, some forgotten. Riker tried to snap him out of it. Martinez, focus. You're still here. Martinez turned his hollow eyes toward him. Am I? Riker didn't answer. Because deep down, he didn't know anymore. That night, the wind howled through the trees, and fear began to creep in again. Not fear of dying, they'd made peace with that. But fear of what they were becoming. Lewis said quietly, "If this keeps going, we'll start thinking things we shouldn't." No one replied. Because everyone already had. Have you ever felt hunger so deep that you start to imagine food that isn't there? Your mind paints smells, sounds, flavors, lies so real you almost taste them. That's what the forest did to them. It whispered feasts. It showed them home-cooked meals, tables full of bread, stew, laughter. Then, when they reached for it, it vanished, leaving only emptiness. By the 12th day, the men had stopped counting time. Their watches had died. Their bodies were too weak to argue with their minds. Martinez saw movement in the trees. He swore it was someone watching. Riker went to look. Nothing. Just shadows. But the feeling didn't fade. Harris woke screaming in the night, clutching his arm. There was something here! I swear! Riker held him down until the panic passed. Then he whispered, "It's not real, Harris." None of it's real. But even he wasn't sure anymore. The forest played tricks now, whispering their names when no one spoke, laughing softly when they cried. They were no longer soldiers. They were survivors, running on fragments of memory and faith. Lewis broke down first. He sat in the mud crying. I can't feel my legs. I can't feel anything. Riker crouched beside him, voice trembling. Don't talk like that. Don't you dare. Lewis looked up, eyes empty. I'd give anything for a piece of bread. Then, quietly, almost too softly to hear. Even if it wasn't bread. The words hung in the air. No one spoke. Because they all knew what he meant. There's a moment in every story of survival where the fight stops being about escape and starts being about what's left of your soul. For these men, that moment had come. By the 13th day, they found a deer carcass. It was half rotten, covered in flies. The smell made them gag. But their bodies screamed louder than their minds. Riker stared at it, frozen between disgust and desperation. He whispered, God forgive us. Then he turned away. But Harris didn't. He fell to his knees beside the carcass, sobbing, shaking. Martinez tried to pull him back. Harris screamed, I can't do this anymore. Riker's voice cut through the air. Enough! We're not animals. But no one was sure if that was true anymore. Have you ever wondered how thin the line is between survival and surrender? How much pain it takes to make good men forget who they are? That line was gone now. That night, the rain came harder. They huddled under broken branches, shivering, praying for morning. No one slept. No one spoke. The sound of thunder felt like judgment. When dawn broke, they saw something through the mist, a faint trail leading downhill. For the first time in days, hope stirred. Riker smiled weakly. Let's move. Maybe it leads somewhere. They followed the trail, step after step, through fog and mud. Every breath hurt, but every step mattered. The forest seemed to watch silently, as if deciding whether to let them go. By evening, the trees began to thin. Martinez whispered, "Do you smell that?" It was faint, smoke. Real smoke. They started running, stumbling, falling. Smoke meant people. People meant food. And food meant life. They didn't know it yet, but the smoke would lead them not to salvation, but to a secret the army had buried long before they ever got lost. The smoke rose like a promise. Thin, gray, twisting through the trees, a thread of hope in a forest of despair. After 13 days of hunger, pain, and silence, the men felt something stir inside them again. It wasn't strength. It was desperation pretending to be hope. They moved faster now. Each step pulled by the scent of burning wood. Their bodies weak, their minds fogged, but their hearts, alive with one last chance. Riker led the way, whispering, "Stay quiet. If it's a camp, we don't know who's there." But in truth, they didn't care who it was. Friend, foe, ghost, anything that could end the hunger. When they broke through the last line of trees, they froze. There it was, a camp. Abandoned. Silent. Tents torn, ashes cold, crates broken open and scattered. The smoke came from a single fire still smoldering, not started recently, but still breathing. They stared at it, eyes wide. They weren't the first to find this place. Martinez stumbled forward, searching through crates. Rations, come on, please. He tore open boxes, empty. Only scraps of paper, dirt, and rusted cans. Lewis fell to his knees, scooping dirt into his hands, trembling. It's gone. Everything's gone. Riker walked slowly to a table half buried in mud. A map lay there, stained, torn. He brushed it off and froze. The map wasn't of this area. It was of something deeper, a zone marked with red ink labeled Restricted Operations. His brow furrowed. What were they doing here? The others gathered around. Harris pointed to a symbol on the corner, the emblem of their own unit. This was ours. His voice shook. This was one of our camps. Riker's stomach turned. If this was one of theirs, why hadn't it been in the reports? Why didn't anyone mention a base here? They searched the ruins more carefully. A notebook, soaked with rain, half-readable. Inside, lists of names, coded entries, strange notations. Martinez read aloud. Phase 4, Survival Evaluation. Subject status, declining. He stopped. What does that mean? Riker didn't answer. He just stared at the page, his mind racing. Subjects. It didn't say. Soldiers. It said. Subjects. The realization spread like poison. This wasn't just a camp. It was an experiment. Somewhere deep in the woods, their own army had tested something, and left it behind. Lewis whispered. They left them here, to die. Silence fell over the group. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening. Riker clenched his fists. No. There has to be another reason. Maybe it's a mistake. But the truth was already clear. No one abandons their own without a reason. Have you ever trusted something so completely, your leaders, your cause, only to realize you were just a piece in their plan? That's what hit them that day. Not hunger. Not pain. Betrayal. They searched further. Behind one of the tents, they found shallow graves, unmarked. Dog tags half buried in mud. Each tag had the same unit number as theirs. Martinez's voice broke. These were our men. Riker's face went pale. This camp was wiped from the records. Erased. He looked at the others, his voice shaking. We're not just lost, are we? They sent us here on purpose. Harris stepped back, terrified. What are you saying, Sarge? Riker took a long breath. I'm saying this forest isn't a mistake. It's a cover-up. They stood there, surrounded by graves, silence pressing on them like weight. The fire crackled softly, the only sound left. Then Lewis said quietly, If this is what they did to their own, what chance do we have? No one answered. Because deep down, they already knew. That night, Riker couldn't sleep. The rain tapped softly against the tents as he read the notebook again. More words half smeared. Observation complete. Remaining units terminated. Report closed. His throat tightened. Terminated. He looked around at his sleeping men, Martinez, Harris, Lewis, and whispered, We were never supposed to come back. Have you ever realized you were part of a story written by someone else, a story that ends before you even know it began? That's what it felt like. Like they were reading the final chapter of their own lives. But then a sound. Faint, from the trees. A voice. At first, Riker thought it was the wind. Then he heard it again, a man's voice, weak, calling for help. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. The others followed, staggering behind. The voice came again, closer this time. Someone was alive. They thought the camp's secret was buried with its dead. But the man they found next would tell them a truth darker than hunger, a truth the army would kill to keep silent. The voice came from the edge of the woods. Weak. Broken. Almost swallowed by the wind. At first, they thought it was their minds again, another cruel trick from the forest. But then, they heard it once more. Help, please! Riker raised his head. That's real, he whispered. The men followed the sound, hearts pounding, hope and fear tangled in every step. Behind a fallen tree, half buried under leaves and dirt, they found him. A soldier. Alive barely. His uniform was tattered, face pale, eyes wild and hollow. Harris knelt beside him, trembling. Sir, who are you? The man coughed, his voice cracked and low. They left us here. Riker leaned closer. Who left you? The man's eyes flickered open, dull gray, full of memories that no one should ever carry. Command, he whispered. They said it was training, survival testing. He gasped, clutching his chest. It wasn't training. It was slaughter. The group went silent. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Martinez said softly, What are you talking about? What happened here? The man's body trembled. Operation Iron Veil. They sent us here to survive for 10 days. No food. No supply. Just watch how long we'd last. Riker's jaw tightened. You're saying they starved their own men? The soldier's cracked lips curved into something between a smile and a sob. They said it was research. Human endurance under combat isolation. He coughed again, blood staining his chin. Most didn't make it. The ones who tried to escape, they made sure we didn't. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that betrayal feels worse than death? That's how they felt listening to him. Every word cut deeper than the hunger. Lewis asked quietly, How did you survive? The man looked away. I didn't. Not really. Silence fell. He continued, voice trembling. I hid when they came to clean the camp. Stayed quiet while they burned the tents. I watched them bury the bodies. He turned to Riker, eyes glassy. You weren't supposed to find this place. None of you were. Riker's voice hardened. What do you mean? The man tried to speak but struggled to breathe. Finally, he whispered, They sent your team to finish it. Riker's heart froze. To finish what? The man's eyes rolled back. Phase 5, he said faintly. Real-time observation. Unaware subjects. You. Then his body went still. Martinez shook him. Hey! Stay with us! But it was too late. The man's hand slipped from Riker's grasp, lifeless. They sat there in silence. 4 starving men, surrounded by lies, realizing they weren't victims of bad luck. They were part of an experiment. Harris broke the silence, his voice shaking. "He's lying, right? Tell me he's lying." Riker stared at the body. "I wish he was." The truth hung heavy, heavier than the hunger, heavier than fear. That night, none of them spoke. They sat by the dying fire, eyes blank, the sound of rain echoing in their heads. The forest that once felt alive now felt haunted. Every rustle, every whisper sounded like a secret being told too late. Have you ever felt like the world around you isn't real anymore? Like you've stepped into a nightmare written by someone else? That's what they felt now. Their purpose, their faith, their duty, all stripped away. They weren't soldiers. They were subjects in a cruel story they never agreed to live. Riker couldn't sleep. The soldier's final words repeated in his head, Phase 5. Real-time observation. "You," he whispered to himself. "If they send us here on purpose, someone is watching." He looked into the trees, and for a moment, he thought he saw something move. A glint of light, like a reflection. Then it was gone. In the early dawn, Lewis shook him awake. "Sir, look!" Up on the ridge, between the trees, a metal tower, half hidden by vines. A radio antenna. And at its base, a bunker. Martinez's voice cracked. "If they were observing us, that's where they did it." Riker stood slowly, eyes burning with a mix of anger and determination. "Then we're going to find out everything." Mid-script call to action, emotional reflection. If you're hearing this story, don't just listen. Remember, sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with guns, but with truth. And truth is something they've been trying to bury for years. Riker turned to his men. "No more running. No more waiting to die. We find that bunker. We end this." The others nodded, silent but resolute. They were weak, starving, half-broken, but now they had a reason to keep going. Not survival. Justice. They thought the forest had taken everything. But what waited inside that bunker would take what little they had left, their trust, their sanity, and one of their own. The bunker stood half-buried under the hillside, silent and forgotten. Vines crept along its walls, roots broke through the cracks. It looked more like a tomb than a building. Riker and his men stood before it, barely able to stand, but too determined to turn back. For days they had fought the forest. Now they would face the truth. Martinez was the first to speak. "What if there's nothing inside?" Riker looked at him with hollow eyes. "Then we'll at least know what nothing looks like." He gripped the rusted handle and pulled. The door groaned open, echoing through the trees like a scream. Inside was darkness, thick, stale, suffocating. The air smelled of metal, mold, and time. They stepped inside. Their footsteps echoed down the narrow hall. Faded signs clung to the walls. "Authorized personnel only, research sector, survival monitoring," Harris whispered. This wasn't just a camp. It was a lab. They found rooms lined with old equipment, screens shattered, notebooks scattered, wires hanging like dead vines. The walls were covered with photographs, faces of soldiers. Dozens of them. Each photo had a number written underneath. Each number was crossed out in red. Lewis ran his trembling fingers over one photo. That's Private Cole." He swallowed hard. "He was in our unit." Martinez flipped through a nearby file. "Subject 14, dehydration complete. Observation terminated." He looked up, eyes wide. They were watching them die. Have you ever seen proof of something you wished wasn't true? The kind of truth that makes your stomach turn, that makes you question everything you've ever believed? That's what they found in that bunker. In another room, they discovered recording tapes stacked high, each labeled by date. Riker picked one up. Day 9, Group 3 observation. He found an old player and slid the tape inside. Static. Then voices. Familiar ones. Subject group shows extreme fatigue. Communication breakdown imminent. Another voice followed, calm and detached. Proceed to stage 3. Let's see how leadership pressure affects morale. Riker's hand shook. That was his voice. The recording continued. Sergeant Riker's group performing as predicted. Do not intervene. He stopped the tape. His heart pounded in his chest. They were watching us. Martinez backed away, horrified. This can't be real, Harris whispered. They were experimenting on their own soldiers, using us like lab rats. Riker stared at the machines, his voice low but sharp. They called it training. But it was a test. A test of how long we could survive without hope. Lewis suddenly screamed and kicked over a chair. They watched us starve. They watched us break. And they did nothing. His voice cracked into a sob. I'm done following orders that kill good men. He turned toward the door, shaking. I'm leaving. Riker grabbed his arm. Where will you go? You think the forest will let you walk out? Lewis jerked free. Better to die out there than in here. He staggered into the tunnel before anyone could stop him. Moments later, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. Silence. Martinez fell to his knees, whispering a prayer. Riker closed his eyes. Another name to remember. Another soul lost to a lie. Harris stared at the walls, tears in his eyes. They used us, for numbers on a chart. Riker's voice hardened. Not anymore. He grabbed a rusted fuel can from the corner, unscrewed the lid, and began splashing it across the floor. Martinez looked up. What are you doing? Riker's jaw tightened. Ending their experiment. Have you ever reached the point where revenge doesn't feel like anger anymore? It just feels like justice? That's where Riker stood now. He lit a match. For a moment, the flame danced between his fingers, soft and fragile. Then he threw it. The fire spread fast, devouring the papers, the walls, the evidence. The tapes melted, the screens cracked, the photographs curled into ash. The bunker screamed with the sound of burning secrets. As they stumbled out into the rain, the bunker behind them became a fire pit of truth. Riker turned to look one last time. No one will ever use our names for their numbers again. But the fire had drawn attention. In the distance, engines. Voices. Helicopters. Harris's eyes widened. They're coming. The army's coming. Riker nodded grimly. Then we run. We make sure someone out there hears the truth before they silence it forever. They turned and disappeared into the forest once more, not as soldiers, not as subjects, but as men running from the very country they served. They thought burning the bunker would end it. But fire doesn't erase the past, it only spreads the smoke. And in that smoke, the world would finally see the truth. The forest was burning behind them. Smoke rolled across the hills like a dark ocean, swallowing the sky. Riker, Martinez, and Harris stumbled through the mud, their bodies trembling, their hearts pounding with something between hope and terror. For 10 days they had starved. For 10 days they had been hunted by silence, by hunger, by lies. Now, for the first time, they were being hunted by their own. They reached an abandoned outpost before dawn. The sign had fallen, the roof was half gone, but the radio tower still stood, crooked, old, stubborn. Like them. Riker leaned against the metal railing, staring up. This is it, he whispered. Our last chance. Martinez nodded, clutching his side. They'll be tracking the fire. We don't have long. Harris unpacked the old transmitter, his hands shaking. He connected wires, twisted knobs, whispered small prayers under his breath. Static filled the air. A faint light blinked on. The signal was alive. Channel open, Harris said softly. Who do we send it to? Riker looked at him. Everyone. He leaned toward the microphone. For a moment, he said nothing. Only the wind spoke. Then, in a voice raw from hunger and grief, he began. This is Sergeant James Riker. If you're hearing this, you need to know the truth. We were sent on a mission, Operation Iron Veil. They told us it was a survival test. They lied. We weren't being tested. We were being studied. He paused, breathing hard. I watched good men die. Not from bullets, not from enemies, but from silence. From hunger. From the decisions of those who thought they could measure a man's worth by how long he can suffer. Harris glanced at the radar. They're moving fast. 10 minutes, maybe less. Riker continued, voice steady. To every soldier who's ever been told to obey without question, remember this: loyalty doesn't mean blindness. And courage doesn't mean silence. He looked at Martinez. You got something to say, brother? Martinez leaned forward, his voice breaking. If anyone finds this, don't forget the names of the ones who didn't make it. Lewis. Cole. Turner. They were more than numbers. They were men. And they deserve better. The door rattled. Engines roared outside. The army had arrived. Riker looked at Harris. Send it. Harris hit the button. The message transmitted into the air, a final heartbeat of truth traveling through static and storm. But before it could finish, the power flickered. Then died. Darkness. Backup battery, Riker said. Harris shook his head. It's gone. That was everything. Martinez sank to the floor. So that's it? Riker stared at the silent transmitter. No, he said quietly. They can cut the power. But they can't kill what's already out there. He stepped to the window. The sky glowed orange with fire. The horizon was a graveyard of secrets. The soldiers outside shouted through megaphones. Sergeant Riker! Stand down! He looked back at Martinez and Harris. Go, he said softly. Get to the ridge. Follow the smoke east. Someone will find you. Martinez's eyes widened. What about you? Riker smiled, a tired, honest smile. I started this. I'll finish it. He picked up the microphone one last time. No power. No signal. But he spoke anyway. To whoever reads the report, know this. We did what we had to. We told the truth. Even if no one listens. He set the mic down and straightened his uniform. As the door burst open, his last words echoed in his mind. 10 days without food, but never a day without purpose. Outside, the soldiers surrounded the bunker. Inside, Riker stood still, a man who had lost everything except his voice. They called him a deserter. A traitor. A ghost of his own army. But those who survived, Martinez and Harris, made it to the ridge. They were found days later, half dead but alive. In their hands was a small, damaged transmitter chip. The message had gone through. Weeks later, a radio operator hundreds of miles away picked up fragments of the broadcast. It was distorted, broken, filled with static. But the words still cut through. We were studied, they watched us starve, tell the world. And the world did. The government denied everything. They said there was no Operation Iron Veil. No experiment. No Sergeant Riker. But soldiers in bases across the country whispered his name. Letters began appearing online, anonymous, unsigned, stories of missions that never made it to record. The truth was out. And it was growing. Sometimes, history is written by the survivors. But sometimes, it's written by the hungry, the ones who refuse to stay silent. Riker didn't live to see what came after. But his words did. And that was enough. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether your pain matters, remember this story. Because somewhere out there, in a forest that still remembers fire, the truth still echoes through the smoke. A voice saying, "We were hungry, but we were human." But Riker's story wasn't the end. Months later, an encrypted file was found in a military archive, labeled only Subject 0. And inside it was a name no one expected.